Okay, I don't know if you've been watching, but the winds of change are blowing hard. I mean, it's almost difficult to keep up. Everything from banning gay pride flags at schools and putting tariffs on Canada and arresting and deporting illegal immigrants, executive orders on energy production, banning DEI in the military, you name it. It's happening at a blistering pace. Look, my job is to keep up with it so I can inform you all about it, right? And I'll be honest, I'm having to pick and choose what to cover because sometimes having 3 hours a day on a radio show is not enough time. Multiple podcasts, still not enough time. But I don't say that like I'm complaining. Not at all. I mean, what we're watching right now, in my opinion, is the restoring of the American dream. So let me give you an analogy. A few years ago, Charlene and I built this house. We had lived in the house we had been in prior to that for 24 years. But the day became when we began to dream about building a house that had features that we designed, that we wanted. This study that I'm in was one of them. I designed the bookshelves in the back and the lighting in it, all of it. This was a place that was a labor of love. We wanted spaces that would bless our family, create a welcoming atmosphere, places we could share with friends. It was a dream. So we went through the whole process from soup to nuts. Chose a contractor, got the bids, got the estimates, secured the financing, broke ground, and it was not always fun. And I'm a pretty handy guy generally, but I've never built a house. I learned all kinds of things though. I've learned that in reality, that sometimes the things you can't see are later on what are needed and take the longest time, but they're the most necessary to make the house the strongest. And one of those moments that we had to wait for was what the contractors folks like to call getting it all dried in. Now, getting a house dried in, what is that? It means that the exterior of the house is completely weatherproofed. All the walls, the roofs are sheathed. The windows and doors installed. It's a weather-resistant barrier has been applied. Basically making the house secure to rain and weather so that it marks the point where the building envelope is considered complete. It's protected from the elements. It ain't sexy. It's not the finished work. But look, I once lived in a neighborhood where a contractor built a whole bunch of what are referred to as spec houses. Those are speculative homes that are built with no buyers in mind, and that contractor, he almost ruined our whole neighborhood as he built one spec house after another, and before he dried one in, he'd start another. And pretty soon we had rotting, weed-ridden, half-filled houses all over our beautiful neighborhood. And there's no wisdom in moving on to work another house when you haven't dried in the first one. And in my opinion, what we're watching right now is the Trump administration working as quickly as possible to get the American dream dried in. I mean, the Biden administration threw everything it had into things like open borders and globalism, left us to rot like an old spec house. We have to secure the structure of the nation, solidifying the weatherproofing of our economy, our borders, our security, all of the infrastructure it takes, all the cultural issues. We have spent the last 4 years, y'all, watching as the American dream was just like spit on by the progressive left. They trashed not just our country, but even who we are as a country. Nothing was sacred. Anything goes. Values meant nothing. Faith was mocked. Look, there's a liberal mantra out there that says that the American dream is somehow gone, that our nation is only for the privileged, for the rich, or certain racial demographics, and that systemically our nation has made it unrealistic for some people to rise above it all because power is only vested in a few. That somehow the ability to rise up and achieve success or accumulate wealth or to even be fulfilled has been stymied, and therefore the few must pay their fair share so that an equitable distribution can be made to those who don't have their own fair share. They call that equity, but equity was never the root basis for the American dream. What we are watching right now as Trump works to get America dried in should not surprise anyone. He said this would be exactly what he would do. In his final speech on the eve of the recent election, he swore that what you are seeing now is exactly what would happen. He said this, and I'm going to quote from his speech. He said, "My message to Americans tonight is simple. We do not have to live this way. We do not have to settle for weakness, incompetence, decline, and decay." And then he went on to say, "We'll help the world. A lot of people think we're isolationists, but we're not. But we want the world to appreciate what we're doing. They have to appreciate that we're helping them." And he added, "I'll restore peace in the world and I'll rescue the American dream." Yeah, Trump said, "Together we will begin the 4 greatest years in the history of our country and we will launch the most extraordinary economic boom the world has ever seen." The actual phrase, The American dream, that thing that I'm saying he has to get dried in first. It's said to have been coined by a historian named James Truslow Adams in the first half of the 20th century in his book called The Epic of America. Adams said this, he said, quote, "The American dream, that dream of a land in which life should be better and richer and fuller for every man, with opportunity for each according to his ability or achievement, it is a difficult dream," he said, "for the European upper classes to interpret. And too many of us ourselves have grown weary and mistrustful of it." And then he said, "It is not a dream of motor cars and high wages merely, but a dream of social order, in which each man and each woman shall be able to attain the fullest stature of that which they are innately capable, and be recognized by others for what they are, regardless of the fortuitous circumstances of their birth or position." That's the American dream. That's where it came from. That's what has to get dried back in, because right now it's not weatherproofed. Right now it leaks. Ronald Reagan once said, "The American dream is not that every man must be level with every other man. The American dream is that every man must be free to become whatever God intends he should become." I've also seen the American dream defined as the belief that anyone, regardless of where they were born or what class they were born into, can attain their own version of success in a society in which upward mobility is possible for everyone. All right, and we know, by the way, there have been struggles in that. There have. And there have been setbacks. And there have been agendas that have made it more difficult. Struggles not to create equity, though, as liberals would try to persuade us, but rather struggles to remove the barriers. That's what we are about. That's what's happening right now. Part of getting it dried in is actually removing barriers that have been now put back in place. Martin Luther King, in his letter from a Birmingham jail, he didn't call for handouts. He made his plea to simply allow that men and women of color could pursue life without inhibition. King said at one point in that, he said, "We will win our freedom because the sacred heritage of our nation and the eternal will of God are embodied in our echoing demands." When these disinherited children of God sat down at lunch counters, he said, they were in reality standing up for what is best in the American dream and for the most sacred values in our Judeo-Christian heritage. And then he ended by saying, thereby bringing our nation back to those great wells of democracy which were dug deep by the Founding Fathers in their formulation of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. So let me ask you this. On the heels of 4 years under a progressive, liberal, globalist agenda, do we still have that now? Do we still have the American dream? Is it still possible that this equality versus equity thing can actually prevail? I believe the answer is still yes. Yes, like in all caps. A big fat yes. Is there work to do? Certainly. Every good house starts with tending the foundation, setting in the framing, ensuring good design, and then getting it all dried in so the finished work can actually take place. And the same is true of the American dream. If we're going to see the next generation have the ability to succeed and not just strive, but actually thrive, then we have to do all we can to dispel the notions that we must spend ourselves into oblivion, giving so-called equitable shares to those who've been deemed somehow less capable. We have to take charge of our economy and ensure that we have a good foundation before we move on to sending out trillions in foreign aid to others. We have to secure our borders, because without a border, you don't really have a sovereign territory and you don't have good rule of law. And we have to become energy independent so that bad actors on the world stage won't have the upper hand against us by setting prices and availability for energy that we need in the modern world. And I suspect that some of it's going to be a bit painful. I do. As we get things dried in, the person who's building the house for themselves to live in and celebrate with their family, they want it yesterday, right? They want to move in right away. They want to take up living. But they know they've got to get it dried in and build the foundation. And that's where we are. Right now, we're in what I would call foundation repair. We're getting the building dried back in. And some of our enemies are bowing up, right? Calling for reprisals. How dare you put tariffs on us? But we're already seeing things come around. It's amazing what can happen when the guiding principle is to first get the house fully dried in. And we are still a good nation. We will help the oppressed. We will be strong allies to our friends. We will be good neighbors to our neighboring nations, but we've got to get this house dried in first. The American dream is real, but it requires a true foundation. All you have to do to maintain the American dream is get the house dried in, and it'll be everything you ever hope to see. But let me step off into a different direction. You see, getting the house dried in requires work, and you don't get there with what I would call self-serving leadership. You don't get there with progressive liberal policies that divide society, and you don't get there by creating a social fabric designed to point out differences, to follow your own truth, to demand capitulation to divisive ideologies. Look, you get there, you get back to the American dream, you get it dried in, you get there by having statesmen. And that's my point for today. You get there by having statesmen who can see the bigger picture, who can act for ideals that are bigger than themselves. Ideals that have, by the way, always lean towards more liberty, not less. Ideals that promote patriotism, not tear it down. Ideals that call for the greater good, not the promotion of a singular little radical squeaky wheel activist group. And that takes statesmen who understand the value of a fight worth having. And the value, by the way, that fight is something they're going to have to pursue. And the view that they are to do their part, to walk in their authority as someone who has freedom, value, tradition, faith, liberty as their aims. Someone who, like I said in a previous podcast, walks in their authority with what they know is their bulletproof influence. Statesman. All right, let me talk for a minute about statesmanship. If you really want to freak someone out, tell them you don't care about what happens to you as long as victory's achieved. I mean, really. Your naysayers won't know what to say to that. They won't. Folks who don't have a broader view of the world, they never really know what to make of someone who tries to make sense of things from a bigger picture. Because most naysayers, they're the ones who have a very singular issue in mind. They have their blinders on. They only see things that affect their one or two issues. They don't get it when someone comes along who is willing to be able to put in the time, the sacrifice, endure the hardships, to actually make things better for more than just themselves. In politics, those people who are willing to accomplish the big stuff that means more than just their own petty re-elections or their little district, those are called statesmen. And oftentimes, that strength to pursue something bigger comes from having even been in a fight before, emerging from it intact. I mean, you learn from it, right? You get in the big fight, you learn from it, you grow from it, you realize that you can actually get hit, and you can hit, and you can still keep moving. Overcoming adversity makes you appreciate what you have all the more, and it creates a different viewpoint. You see the world. I can tell you for a fact, when I came home from war, things seemed fresher, things seemed different, and there's a lot of things that I could put in perspectives that I didn't have before that. That's why it's so important for a football team to practice in full pads and trade blows on the practice field so they don't go out to the game and actually avoid hits that they need to endure to win the game. That's why boxers have sparring partners, so they learn to trade blows for the big match. That's why, like General Norman Schwarzkopf said once, he said the more you sweat in training, the less you bleed in war. And in politics, the ability to trade those blows and stick to your guns, that's what changes somebody from a politician to a statesman. All across the nation, state and federal elected legislators are doing what they do. They're debating good bills, they're stopping bad bills, they're passing budgets, and I can tell you from experience there's going to be political machinations that will make no sense at times. There will be legislators at the state and federal level who can't see past the nose on their face, right? There will be some who will only do what the lobbyists tell them to do. But I also know from experience, there will be some who will take to the floor of the House or Senate and Congress, or in their state houses in their respective states, and they will, with a statesman-like attitude, do what is right for the greater good because that's who they are. The ones who don't have that view, those are often the ones who did not become stronger by being in a good fight, because there are good fights. Either A, they got whooped one time in a fight and now they're gun shy and they're scared of doing more, or B, they've never been in a fight, so they don't have any idea how to trade blows when the opposition comes in swinging. I can just tell you right now, many of the Republicans in our state supermajorities that we have around the different states like Alabama that I'm in, they've had the joy of being large and in charge for a long time, and they have no idea what it really means to have a good fight, to stand their ground on behalf of the greater good. A few years back, there was a class of freshman legislators, men and women, who came into the Alabama House and Senate having endured one of the most brutal campaign seasons in Alabama history. It was called the Republican Wave of 2010 in Alabama. The Tea Party was very active. There was a grassroots effort like I had never seen before, and maybe had never been before in our state. People were just plain tired of corruption. The Democrats had actually controlled the Alabama State House for 136 straight years. And man, that election season, I'm going to tell you right now from firsthand experience, it was a slugfest. The teachers union especially fought often and dirty. I was proud to be a part of that wave, and I know for a fact that those of us who overcame all that nastiness in the elections, we were then better prepared for the fights that had to come afterward. I know one guy who actually won his election by the narrowest of margins despite the fact that his opponent was doing things like paying strippers to show up at his front door as some form of entrapment. I personally had supporters tell me that they had their businesses threatened because they put up my signs. But if we fought those battles, and we did, we fought those battles, then we knew going into the State House that the ones that would come after would be easier. We would be more prepared, and perhaps we would be maybe walking with a straighter spine. And yeah, they did. They tried to harass us. They tried to dox us. They tried to dox our families. They tried to dox our businesses. They did things that shouldn't ever have to be done because someone simply stood up and said, I'm willing to try and run for office. I could tell you story after story of men and women that I served with in the Alabama State House for 8 years who came in, though, battle-scarred with a desire to pursue a different agenda, a broader agenda, a statesman's agenda. But it only came when we knuckled down and got into the fight and then lived to fight another day. Now, the progressive left, it'll lash out with the most ridiculous and unfounded attacks, and when they didn't get us to cow down, they would often resort to personal attacks. I recall so many times being verbally accosted for daring to suggest a different budget or a different way of handling education or considering how to save public retirement that was on the verge of collapse. The mantra from the left became, you do what we want or we'll make sure you never get reelected. My response used to tick them off to no end because what I would usually do would reply, oftentimes in writing in an email. I'd reply, I didn't get elected to get reelected. I'm going to do what I believe is right. And I would love to take credit for that phrase, but I can't. I learned it from a real statesman. I learned it from someone who had been through the fire already. I learned it from somebody who had even lost elections and pushed for unpopular options at times because he knew, that person did, that there was a bigger plan, a broader narrative, one that held to higher principles, one that was worth fighting for, because that's what statesmen do. And that man was Ronald Reagan, who I read once in one of the books on the shelf behind me, that he was preparing to take on a major issue at some point that could be considered political suicide. His top advisors told him, don't do it. Don't do it, out of a sense of political expediency. But Reagan, with all the scars of his prior battles in the public arena, he told him, I didn't get elected to get reelected. Let's do the right thing. That's a statesman. So yeah, the politician makes promises but may not deliver on them once elected. But a statesman is a person who will stand by his ideals and does everything in his power to do what he believes is right for the people of his community, his state, his country. Statesmen stand on a platform of fundamental truths, principles, and they have those scars from the prior fights. Statesmen know you got to get the house dried in. You got to firm up the foundation before you can do any of the finish work, because when the fur starts flying and the attacks come from all angles, and they will, it is the embedded principles and the knowledge of prior survival of big fights and the willingness to tackle what is necessary to get the foundation straight that a statesman's going to lean on to get him or her through the fight. Oh, by the way, a statesman cannot be somebody who is myopic. They can't do what I described earlier about people who are single-issue voters. They don't have that luxury. A statesman has to be broad and deep, able to address the issues from a bigger perspective. Can they adjust from a fight on cultural issues over here and then pivot over here to do fiscal issues? Are they effective in the arena of facing down attacks on constitutional liberties that we enjoy as people in America, and then pivot again to a debate about things like economic development or military spending or education reform or abortion or prison, on and on and on? Can they see past the moment they are in to decide what is for the greater good? You see, a statesman is one who recognizes that his or her position has given them that opportunity for power too. Power, actual power of position. Power over people. Power that can become a distraction. Power that can become a tyranny if you're not careful. And statesmen do not give way to the idea of power. For a statesman, it is antithetical to pursue tyranny or to lord themselves over others. A statesman looks at the needs of others first. George Washington, fresh on the heels of victory in the Revolutionary War, he was granted what the Continental Congress called unlimited powers in 1777 to pursue the fight against the British. Responding back to the Congress, Washington said, quote, "I shall constantly bear in mind that as the sword was the last resort for the preservation of our liberties, so it ought to be the first thing laid aside when those liberties are firmly established." Washington famously resigned his commission as a general before taking the office of the presidency, and he also declined, by the way, to serve more than 2 terms. He was a statesman. He was honed by the fight, standing on principles in the fight for the greater good. And y'all, we need more statesmen in our government. We need them right now for such a time as this, and we need them to fight. But yeah, that fight, like I said, is not something that everyone has a stomach for. Many of whom have never even been through a fight. They too often come to the political table with good resumes but no background in bare knuckles political warfare. Their principles are too often based on their softer version of just keeping the train running, right? Well, Navy SEALs have a saying, the only easy day was yesterday, meaning what's behind you is done, but today is going to be hard. So quit whining, face the day. Army Rangers, we're taught to live by the Ranger Creed, which opens up with the phrase, recognizing that I volunteered as a Ranger, fully knowing the hazards of my chosen profession. Every Ranger knows they're in something that comes with hazards, but they volunteered anyway. The bottom line is, if it was easy, everybody'd do it. But make no mistake, we need people willing to do the hard things. We need people willing to take a statesman-like stand. We need people who are willing to say, we got to get this house dried in, and you know what? It's bigger than me. We're going to get her done, whether it makes people mad or not sometimes. We're in a watershed moment right now in American politics. You can call it the MAGA movement. You can call it the restoration of common sense politics. It's the return of values, the return of values-based political discourse, conservative legislation. I spoke to one conservative state legislator the other day, by the way, right here in Alabama. She's one of the few who remains in the State House that was one of the freshmen that I spoke of when we all came in 2010, when we stormed the State House, we like to say. She said the air is electric right now in the State House again, and that the feeling she gets on the state Senate floor right now is something she hasn't felt since those halcyon days of 2010. But if you've been watching or participating, then you know that electric air she's talking about, it did not come easy. And the attacks are going to keep coming, and the only easy day was yesterday, and our role as conservatives is to not let it be taken away. Our job now is to champion the good stuff, to point out the bad stuff, to demand accountability, to do the work, to get the house dried in. Because preservation of this victory that we just had is not going to last if all we do is muster up some keyboard courage and type out a little something on social media. It's not enough just to yell at the TV news. We can't just say, oh good, Trump's got it. Because it takes an army to fight what the general directs. So Trump may be the key figure, certainly, but we are all key players, and the only easy day was yesterday. So pick your battlefield, stake your claim, make your stand, choose your cause, get involved, do the hard thing, fully knowing the hazards of your chosen profession. Because I'll be honest with you, stories are not told in reverent tones of those who sat idly by. History will look back on this time, and they will take note if we squander this victory by staying too comfortable. How are future generations going to judge our actions or our inactions? So will we raise up a statesman? Or statesmen, plural, I hope? Will we elect or become people who see the bigger picture? People who know the value of the American dream and that you have to get it dried in, that the dream requires a true foundation? A willingness to maintain the American dream by, like I said, getting the house dried in so that it can be everything you've ever hoped to see. Will we find those people who see the fight and enter the fray and recognize the scars from previous fights are what prepares them for the next fight? And they're going to do it no matter how uncomfortable it might get. And will we then capitalize on those moments? Will we build the foundation? Will we be statesmen? Will we do the hard thing? It is so worth it, y'all. But it'll take some stalwart statesmen for such a time as this. That's my philosophy.